Hello and welcome. I'm Sukhendu Das. I teach in the Department of English, Bankura University. I'm also the coordinator of Center for Research in Post-Humanities, Bankura University. It's my pleasure and an honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Roberto Marchesini. Professor Marchesini is Director of School of Human-Animal Interactions and the Center for the Study of Posthumanist Philosophy. Marchesini is also an ethologist, philosopher who has been involved in the study of animals since 1980s. He combines scientific and philosophical perspectives to address a range of questions about evolution, behavior, mind, subjectivity, culture, and ethics. With colleagues, he developed a school of animal interaction and training that is based on treating animals, dogs, horses, cats, and others as minded interlocutors in social interaction rather than using negative reinforcement and simple conditioning. He is the best known exponent of Jew anthropology and posthumanism in Italy. He has developed unique versions of both that can contribute to the Anglophone literature on them. His writings span the gamut from lyric poetry to cognitive science, geoanthropology, posthumanism, and bioethics. He was a student of Italian entomologist and ethologist Giorgio Cilli and had a long collaboration with astrophysicist Margarita Hack. I welcome Professor Marchesini again. Professor Marchesini, the entire platform is now all yours.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference. We touch on a topic very dear to me. I'm very pleased to be here with you on this important occasion. I believe that the reflection on the relationship between the human being and the human species and the other species is one of the most important topics today in the face of the serious ecological crisis. Anthropocentrism cannot be questioned. To do this, we need to change the way we think about animality. We need to move from the concept of the animal as an entity opposed to the human being to an animal dimension that includes the human being, but we cannot do this without questioning the very concept of animality. My talk is focused on this topic. Now I'm ready to share the presentation on the problem of animal ontology is mainly a philosophical question, which, however, requires a close comparison with descriptive disciplines such as physiology and ethology. In fact, it's necessary to observe how an animal behaves in interaction with the world and to submit the evidence collected to an ontological reflection. First of all, animality is an expression of the phenomenology of life, and this basic level should also be investigated. The animal presents itself to us as an individual with its own biography and personality. But this individual condition is nothing more than a declination of the species, which presents specific adaptative predicates. On the other hand, each species is a declination of the animal condition in general, which has its own meta-predicates to differentiate it from what is not animal. Animality characterizes the animal condition, not a particular species, So I will call predicates the adaptative characters, meta-predicates the animal condition in general. We can say that meta-predication characterize all animals, includes human being, while predicates indicate how that species has expressed its own animality in an adaptative sense. Therefore, animality is not a predicative condition because what manifests is the species, not the animal. Animality is a meta-predicative condition that unites humans and other animal species. The species and therefore also the human being is a declination of animality, a way in which animality assumes phenomenological predicates. Tradition has passed on to us a compromised idea of animality. Its contents are hardly problematized. I believe that lack is due to an anthropocentric need to have a counterpart that can stand out through opposition against the human condition, hence the lack of investigative interest in the topic of animality. The need to define a backdrop that can fully enhance human specializes has seriously jeopardized the possibility of developing an unbiased analysis. The comparison is based on a fundamental error because one is trying to compare a species, the human being, which is a predicative entity, with a concept, the animal, which is a meta-predicative entity. The human being can only be compared to another species, not to a concept. If I construct the concept of animal through a supposed opposition to man, I will create an artifact made through tautology. The reason is that the human does not perceive itself as an animal, other than in pure somatic terms. When speaking of animality, therefore, we refer to something else that a common and shared dimension. If the animal is viewed as a counterpart, it comes natural to define it in an opposite term by looking for the predicative difference between the human and the non-human. But one must also by cautions of the difference that the human attribute to themselves for the supremative in the idea that the human being is the only who, for the subsumption in the idea that the human being encompassed all virtues, for metric in the claim of measuring humans against other beings, for hierarchy in the belief that there is a quantitative difference. Every species, including humans, is simply different in quality from other species. Generally, ethology is limited to describing animal behavior, trying to do so with extreme diligence, completeness, and accuracy, and this is very useful. However, it is then necessary to insert these data into an explanatory model. Unfortunately, even today, the model based on behavior automatism is still used. There is talk of awareness, problem solving, abilities, self consciousness, but no new model is offered. The idea that the animal is driven by automatism is not different from Descartes' conception of the animal as a machine. It's saying the same thing in a different way, but an animal cannot simply be limited to triggering its automatism because It would need as many automatisms as there are situations in a redundancy to provision. It constantly faces new situations because the world does not repeat itself and therefore the animal cannot simply repeat. The machine model simply doesn't work. If we take Brentano concept of consciousness, we deduce that we are always conscious of something. So consciousness refers to a content. It does not produce it. This means that subjectivity must precede consciousness. Consciousness is like the light that illuminates a landscape. It does not create it, but simply make it visible. That is, it makes it explicit. The landscape precedes that light that illuminates it, and in fact, today we know that much of our subjectivity is unconscious. To understand animal ontology, I will therefore start from the concept of subjectivity, taking into consideration the five levels of subjectivity, the concept of animal agency, the concept of animal design, the concept of self ownership, the concept of animal freedom, the concept of creativity. Subjectivity. Subjectivity is an emergency that arises from a particular expression of the phenomenology of life. I believe that subjectivity is to be connected to three aspects that characterize the animal condition: heterotrophy, having to obtain the energy to live by eating; peripatesis, the tendency to move around the environment and look for opportunities and risk; sensitivity, the ability to experience pleasure or pain. To understand subjectivity, I make use of five levels or essential properties that allow the animal to be the protagonist of its own existence. Being a protagonist does not mean violating physical, chemical laws, but bending them to your own interest. As Conrad Lawrence said, it means admitting that life is something more and cannot be reduced to abiotic phenomena. The first level in animals, somatic movement requires sensory adaptation systems. In this sense, animals have developed nervous networks which are responsible for processing incoming information. In fact, it's necessary to distinguish the landscape modification produced by an animal motion from those that derive from change due to external events. This is why, when we look at a different target scattered over the horizon, we don't have the impression that the world is also moving. The ability to separate the effects experienced when interacting with the world sensibility from the effect produced by own action on the world agentivity can be considered the basic requirement of a self that reacts an activity project. The ability to differentiate a self that receives from a non-self that undergoes what happens to it can therefore be considered experiential subjectivity. The second level, one of the most evident characteristics of the animal being is its orientation toward the outside world in a dimension of interest and of defense of such interest in a logic of self-expansion. These two expressions of interest also create specificities because each animal is interested in different things and is the bearer of its own interest. An animal is interested in the world because the realization of its interest is still with opportunity and risk that the subject must really grasp in external reality. The animal is open to the world precisely because it's a bearer of interest. The condition induces it to transform the external scenario into events that define a maximum value of its interest, which can therefore be translated into a state of the body, emotional feeling, or into a projection space that establishes the degrees of accessibility for the expression of its behavioral tendencies and therefore the possible objectives, motivation, desiring. The third level, life poses continuous problem to the animal and it's not possible to implement a repetitive behavior because every situation is different. But when an animal performs trying to solve a problem, it cannot act too random because the possibility would be so many that it would inevitably be faced with a statement. In other words, the research must be explained through a modeling other than automatism. In this model, innate and learned endowments are seen as tool, not as automatism, at the subject disposal or translation resources that the individual can use to realize its affective drives. The individual cannot apply them specifically because they are available resources which it has full ownership of. A tool can be used because, unlike an automatism, it has more function. The subject uses its endowments instead of being driven by them. The fourth level, it's not enough to mechanically respond to a stimulus or to discharge an urge in some activity because the world always presents challenges and an animal must be a problem solver. Versatility is a prerequisite for adaptation, whether you are a wasp or a beaver. Without protagonism is in using endowments, phylogenetic skill would not make sense. Now, among the dimensions of subjectivity, consider what we call mind, the unitary condition arising from the integration of various components. The quality we recognize in a subject include the homogeneity of expression, whereby the individual can be identified as a unit of purpose and persistent over time in the form of a solid and substantive whole capable of maintaining its identity through change. The ultimate level of subjectivity is created by consciousness, by the ability to transform a state of mind in a condition present to the subject. We can imagine consciousness as the act of illuminating a propositional process of the mind. Consciousness is therefore a functional state of mind, concentrating all attentional resource on a particular projection of subjectivity. Consciousness does not produce subjectivity but makes it explicit. Subjectivity produces consciousness, not the other way around. As an explicative function, consciousness is intentional, refer to something, and therefore more or less complex. We have sentience as a perceptive consciousness, reflexivity as awareness of thoughts, affectiveness as a consciousness of emotion, self-consciousness as self-awareness, the theory of mind as consciousness of altered state of mind. Consciousness allows the animal a greater ability to bring out the condition of novelty and therefore to implement the behaviors that are closer to a specific situation. The animal agency. Being subjective means having your own orientation toward the world, having your own purposes, being a protagonist and not passive in the action you produce. A subject does not let himself be carried by the current of events, but chooses the side and is able to go against the current. Being a subject means using the law of the world and not simply being moved by them. The animal design, to be a subject, means to possess a present and not simply be inserted in a chain of events. The subject emerges from the flow of time and imposes a direction and rhythm on the phenomenological sequence. We recognize a subject precisely by virtue of its own being present. We can say that subjectivity is highlighted in a condition of animal design because an animal is not positioned but take place in space and time. To be a subject means to possess a present and not simply be inserted into a chain of events. The subject emerges from the flow of time and imposes a direction and rhythm of the phonological questions. We recognize the subject precisely by virtue of its being present. We can say that subjectivity is this design. The animal is free because it's subjected to many variables that influence its physiological, psychological, and behavioral condition. Every animal is influenced by phylogenetic components that push it to perform certain action, physiological needs, often plural and concomitant, knowledge it has learned during its life, specific environmental factors that trigger its behavior. Freedom arises from the convergence of a factor, from its being a system of a causal plurality. Subjectivity is the condition to allow us to talk about individual protagonism as well as creativity. Equality requires full possession of own cognitive endowments that through total of tools for use, not as automatism, the presence of internal motives in the form of interest that induce the subject to find new solution and innovative is behavior function. A unitary mind capable of putting together and arbitrarizing the different functions. Creativity is the ability to go beyond the cognitive tools one possesses to express new behavior. A behavior is new when it's not limited to be a simple repetition of something previously acquired. An individual possesses a set of skills of phylogenetic and ontogenetic origin. Creativity lies in the ability to go beyond the skill, even using them, but in an innovative way. It doesn't matter how far-reaching an invention is in our eyes, but how distant that behavior is compared to just repeating previous skills. Subjective skills. Through behavior, the animal responds to the challenges that the environment poses and at the same time expresses its own species canon. to be effective with respect to the tasks that are subjected to it, the animal has two endowments of competence at its disposal. That which derives from phylogenesis, from the history of the species through the process of natural selection, that which concerns the history of the individual ontogenesis through learning processes. The consciousness, we deduce that we are always conscious of something. So consciousness refers to a content. Consciousness is like the light. So that. Okay. In order to be creative, an animal must be endowed with subjectivity, which is not necessarily conscious, so that subjectivity must be explained through a new model that makes the animal condition of protagonism. Animal creativity occurs in different ways, and each caused by different processes of interaction between the individual and the world. We can say that our condition where creativity is a basic function to adapt behavior, where creativity is facilitated by the specific state of the subject, where creativity is necessitated by the subject's difficulty in finding a solution, where creativity is imposed by the urgent of situation. Creativity is a basic and necessary function for adapting skill to the particular situation that the animal must face. Each circumstance is a little different, and the animal cannot simply repeat if it wants to adhere to the situation. Each time it has to manage a small margin of novelty. The best way to do this to use the technique of assimilation and accommodation, making small correction to the competence. There are situations that facilitate creative behavior, such as exploration, communication, and the use of tools. The condition that most facilitates creativity is play. First of all, playing does not present strings and condition, and therefore facilitates testing behavior. As a second aspect, during play, the different behavioral areas enter into relationship with each other, giving rise to hybrid expression. As a third aspect, playing involves and stimulates the imagination. Creativity is often a necessary condition when the problem has not relevance to previous experiences or acquired skills. The problem-solving situation asks the subject to invent a new path and cannot be found without creativity. It's often said that when faced with a problem, an animal makes random attempts, but if this were the case, it would never arrive at the solution. The subject makes attempts, but always oriented and equipped with a certain amount of creativity. In fact, it involves using solution recipes, heuristic, by inventing new ways of using skills. Often, the mechanism used is that cognitive restyling, the use of skills in other contexts. Sometimes it's the urgency of the situation that stimulates creativity, especially when it comes to bringing home an important result. We must never confuse creativity with behavior with competence. Many behaviors seems to present a great creative capacity, but these are innate behaviors. Urgent creativity often makes the subject appear not very gifted, but it's precisely in that moment that its creativity is revealed in its ability to cope. Animal is a subject because it's a construct or literally extracts a forma mundi. It's being present on the scene does not end with registering what is there, but with realizing what could be there. The individual is not limited to the already given, whether apparent or to be discovered, but actualizes new states ex novo while respecting the constraints of reality. The presence of the animal, therefore, can only be based on creative expression. By I think the animal is always creative because it's caught up in itself, in its feeling, emotion, and desiring condition, which drive to it to produce a surplus creativity. I mean, a dialogue between subject and word, whereby if creation is a novelty, it's also unexpected because both subject and word develop something unpresented, becoming co-factor in the process, an extraction of a possible form, one that is conceived even if not yet present, from the virtual condition of reality through a new organization. A question I am often asked is what is the most intelligent animal? But this is the wrong question because there is not such thing as a more intelligent animal, just as there could be not animal that is more endocrine. Intelligence is an adaptive function, meaning it's a trait that's been subjected to a selective pressure. So it's inevitable that selection has shaped intellectual abilities differently depending on the specific needs of the species. First, we have different cognitive structure. The swarm intelligence of social hymenoptera, the distributed intelligence of cephalopods, the ganglionic intelligence of arthropods, the extending intelligence of animals that use tools, the symbiotic intelligence that comes from the microbiome, the centralized intelligence of the science in vertebrates. Um, we have many types of intelligence, such as social intelligence, with the ability to move freely and innovatively with a complex system, knowing how to build mediation and negotiation, as well as cooperative structure, like wolf or primate. Uh, Puzzling intelligence or the ability to solve problems, to take them through standardized expression by the tendency to look inside the problem, trying to identify the structural requirements, like cat, for example. Aesthetic orientative intelligence, that is the tendency to identify clues or signals and transform them into chosen standard or orientation maps in the birds, for example. Technical and operational intelligence, which refer to the ability to identify new strategy of tools to achieve one's goals through a pragmatic function relationship with the world, like a primate. Kinesthetic intelligence, meaning to ability to organize one psychomotor skills, adapting them the situation and exploring all movement possibility of one body, referential intelligence of the tendency to learn from external reference, both conspecific and heterospecific, use other as models and facilitating the development of cultural tradition like chimpanzee. Communicative intelligence understands as the ability to use abstract symbol to refer to particular entities to be transmitted to a referent as well as possess metalinguistic abilities like dolphin or chinus, empathic and self-reflective intelligence, which refers to the ability to understand others' condition, to act based on this interpretation, and to observe aware of own disposition and characteristics. In other words, presence is not total immersion in the apparent condition, but the capacity to reveal hidden properties, possible outcomes, new correlation, that is the virtual richness of a situation, including possible setbacks and deviation from previous experiences. Precisely for this reason, presence established a much stronger conjugation with reality because it means looking inside, not stopping at appearances, revealing new opportunities. In a word, intelligence is intus legere. Unveiling explored possibility means, in fact, building an even closer relationship with the world, inaugurating new figurations enabled by the expressive space. Creativity is an important factor in evolution of living thing. Through creativity, an animal can modify its performances, for example, by building a tool or discovering a new use. This inevitably produces a modification of selective pressures due to the change of niche. The animal is therefore not passive in the end of natural selection, but through niche modification produced by invention and innovation, changing selective pressure, it influences the trajectory of the species. Creativity frees the potential of the subject, make it fly towards a new existential dimension. Creativity is like wings for the mind. It's the oxygen of thoughts. It's the sense that each individual has to interpret its presence in the world like an actor who, despite having a script, when he goes on stage, must necessarily interpret and play his part. Thank you for.
Now I would like to open this session for Q&A. So I would request our participants, if you have any question or any observation, you can raise by unmuting yourself, or you can also write your queries or questions or your suggestions or your ideas in the chat.
If you want the presentation, I send you. Okay, I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roberto Marchesini, for this wonderful talk. We are really grateful to listen to your insightful talk, and we are enriched. Thank you and have a nice day.
Okay, bye, Sunkenum.